My name is Daisy Knox, and I'm 32 years old. 5 years ago, 3 days before Thanksgiving, my mother called me and said 7 words that shattered everything I thought I knew about my family. Don't come home this year. Your sister doesn't want drama. No explanation. No apology. Just a door quietly slammed shut on 27 years of trying to belong. That Thanksgiving, I ended up eating dinner alone at a restaurant in Boston. I sat at a small table by the window while families around me laughed, passed plates of turkey and mashed potatoes, and toasted to being together. I remember staring at my food while it slowly went cold, trying to blink back tears I didn't want strangers to see. What I didn't know that night was that the people sitting at the table next to me would end up becoming the family I had always wished for. And I definitely didn't know that 5 years later, those same strangers would be introduced at my wedding as the parents of the bride, while my biological parents stood in the back of the room uninvited, realizing they had been replaced in every way that mattered. Before we continue, please take a moment to like and subscribe to the channel, but only if you genuinely enjoy it. And please let me know where you're listening from and what time it is where you are. I will read all the comments. Now let me remind you of the phone call that started it all. I remember exactly where I was standing when my phone rang. It was November 21st, 3 days before Thanksgiving. I was in my tiny studio apartment in Boston, surrounded by half-packed bags and the faint smell of the pumpkin candle I had lit earlier that evening. I'd been trying to get myself into the holiday spirit. My train ticket back to Connecticut was already booked. Non-refundable, of course. My suitcase sat open on the bed. I was folding sweaters and deciding which pair of boots to bring when my phone lit up on the nightstand. Mom. I smiled when I saw her name and picked up immediately. Hey, Mom. I was just about to call you, I said, balancing the phone against my shoulder, but she cut me off before I could finish. Daisy. Her voice was flat, cold. I need to tell you something. My stomach dropped instantly. That tone never meant anything good. What's wrong? I asked. Is Dad okay? Your father is fine. There was a pause. A long one. Then she said it. Listen, I've been thinking, don't come home this year. For a second I actually laughed because I thought she had to be joking. What do you mean Piper doesn't want drama? My mother said. I straightened slowly. Drama? What drama? She's pregnant again. Mom continued. She doesn't need stress right now. I tightened my grip on the phone. I haven't even talked to Piper in months. Exactly, my mother said sharply. And let's keep it that way. I stared out the window at the gray Boston sky as snow began drifting down past the buildings. You know how you get, she added. My voice cracked before I could stop it. How I get? You're sensitive. You turn everything into an issue. Mom, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. Last year, I just asked her why I wasn't invited to her baby shower. That's not drama. That's a question. See? She replied immediately. That's exactly what I mean. You always make everything about yourself. I stood there frozen. 27 years old, and my mother was telling me I wasn't welcome at Thanksgiving because I had once asked why I'd been excluded. I already bought my ticket, I said quietly. Then get a refund. Her tone left no room for negotiation. Piper is pregnant. She doesn't need stress. You understand? And then the line went dead. I stood there holding the phone long after the call had ended. Outside, the snow kept falling. Inside my apartment, the candle flickered softly on the windowsill, filling the room with that fake warm scent of pumpkin and cinnamon, like the holiday I had been trying so hard to believe I still belonged to. And as I sat down on the edge of my bed staring at my useless train ticket, a familiar realization settled quietly over me. I understood perfectly. In my family, I had always been the acceptable sacrifice. From that point onward, the story is no longer simple. What follows is a blend of pieces of reality and some fictional elements. Perhaps you'll recognize something familiar. But if you don't find anything striking today, that's perfectly fine. Take care of yourself. Take a few deep breaths, and we'll meet again in another story. I wish I could say that phone call was the first time something like that had happened. But as I sat on the edge of my bed staring at my useless train ticket, memories started surfacing one after another like a highlight reel of quiet disappointments I had spent most of my life pretending didn't matter. The first one that came back was my 16th birthday. I had planned that day for months. Nothing big, nothing extravagant, just a small party with 3 of my closest friends. My mom had promised we'd have cake at home and then go bowling afterward. I remember how excited I was. I had even picked out a blue dress that I thought made me look older than 16. But the morning of my birthday, Piper called the house crying. She had failed her calculus final and was convinced it meant she would never get into a good college. Within minutes, the entire focus of the day shifted. My party was canceled. Instead of cake and bowling, we spent the afternoon sitting around the kitchen table comforting Piper while she cried. "Don't be dramatic, Daisy," my mother had said when I tried to protest. "Your sister needs us more right now. You can celebrate next weekend." We never did. Then there was my college graduation. I had worked harder for that moment than anything in my life. 4 years of late nights, part-time jobs, and living off instant noodles because tuition and rent had taken every dollar I had. I graduated with honors. I was the first person in my family to do that. When I walked across the stage to receive my diploma, I scanned the crowd looking for my parents. I had saved 2 seats for them near the front. I imagined my mother waving proudly, my dad smiling the way he used to when I brought home good report cards. But the seats were empty. They showed up almost 2 hours later. By the time they arrived, the ceremony had long since ended, and most families were already leaving campus. "Piper had a prenatal checkup this morning," my mother explained casually, as if that answered everything. It couldn't be rescheduled. My sister was pregnant with her first child at the time. "You understand, sweetheart," Mom added. "The baby is more important than a ceremony. More important than me." That was what she meant. That was always what she meant. Over the years, I learned something important about my family. Complaining only made things worse. If I expressed hurt, I was told I was being sensitive. If I asked questions, I was accused of causing problems. If I tried to defend myself, I was labeled dramatic. "Why can't you just be happy for your sister?" I heard that sentence more times than I could count. So eventually, I stopped arguing. I stopped asking questions. I made myself smaller, quieter, easier. I told myself that if I just stayed agreeable long enough, if I stopped needing so much, maybe eventually, they would choose me too. But sitting there in my cold Boston apartment at 27 years old, staring at a useless train ticket and a packed suitcase, something inside me finally cracked. There was no version of myself small enough to earn that love. I picked up my phone again and scrolled to my dad's contact. For a moment, I hesitated. My father had always been the quiet one, the peacekeeper, the man who sat in the middle of every conflict and somehow never took a side. But part of me still believed, maybe foolishly, that if I explained what had happened, he would step in. Just this once. The phone rang 4 times before he answered. "Hey, kiddo." His voice sounded cautious. He already knew. "Dad," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Did Mom tell you what she said?" A pause. I could hear the television in the background, probably a football game. "She mentioned it. And you're okay with this?" Another pause. Longer this time. "You know how your mother is, Daisy." I closed my eyes. "She told me not to come home for Thanksgiving." "I know. You don't think maybe I should be allowed to spend Thanksgiving with my own family?" Silence. I could hear him breathing into the phone. From where I stood, I could almost picture him sitting in his recliner, rubbing his forehead the way he always did when he wanted to escape a difficult conversation. "Dad," I said softly, "do you want me there?" 5 seconds passed. then 10. Finally, he cleared his throat. I think it might be better if you listen to your mother this year. Something inside me went very still. Not anger. Not even sadness. Just emptiness. Okay, I said quietly. Daisy, don't be like that. It's fine, I interrupted. I hung up before he could say anything else. He didn't call back. The apartment grew darker as evening settled over the city. I sat there by the window watching the last light fade across the snow-covered street. My father had been given a chance, one small moment to stand up for me, to say one simple word in my defense. But like he always had, he chose silence. For years, I had told myself he was neutral. Now, I finally understood the truth. He wasn't neutral. He was just standing on their side. I sat there for a long time staring out at the falling snow, letting that realization settle. And as the darkness filled the room, something else settled too. A quiet decision. If I wasn't welcome at their table anymore, then maybe it was time to stop waiting for an invitation. Thanksgiving morning arrived gray and quiet. I woke in my studio apartment to footsteps from the unit above me. Someone's family was arriving. I heard a child laugh, a door open, and close voices greeting each other with excitement. The smell of food drifted through the vents. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling before finally getting up. My phone sat on the nightstand where I had left it. Silent. No calls. No messages. Not even happy Thanksgiving. I told myself I wasn't expecting one. But after 27 years of hoping things might change, hope doesn't disappear overnight. I made instant coffee and sat by the window watching snow fall onto the street below. By noon, loneliness won. I opened Instagram. The first post was from Piper. In the photo, my family sat around the dining table at my parents' house in Connecticut. My mom and dad sat side by side. Piper sat beside her husband Tyler. Their son sat in a high chair wearing a tiny turkey sweater. Everyone was smiling. The caption read, "So grateful for my family. These are the people who matter most." I stared at the photo too long. Then I zoomed in. 4 adults, 1 toddler, 5 chairs. There wasn't even an empty seat where I should have been. They hadn't just excluded me. They had erased me. I closed the app and set my phone down. Part of me wanted to spend the day under a blanket pretending the holiday didn't exist. Maybe that was what I deserved, a sad meal alone in a dark apartment. After all, that was the role I had been given in my family story, the dramatic daughter who ruined everything. But something inside me pushed back. No. I wasn't going to spend Thanksgiving feeling sorry for myself. If I had to eat dinner alone, I would do it somewhere with light. Somewhere with people. I pulled on my coat and scarf and stepped outside. Harborview Grill was open. It was warm. The smell hit me, first roasted turkey bread, butter, herbs. Then the sound, conversation, laughter, the soft clink of glasses. "Just one tonight." "Just one," I said. She led me toward the back. My table was a 2-person setup squeezed beside a large family gathering. The family next to me was celebrating big. At the head sat an older couple. Beside them sat a middle-aged couple with 2 young children. At the far end was a younger man around my age who seemed responsible for most of the laughter. They passed dishes without asking. They interrupted each other. They teased each other with easy affection. I tried not to stare, but it was impossible not to watch them from the corner of my eye, because that was what family was supposed to look like. A server appeared. "The Thanksgiving special, please," I said. He nodded and disappeared into the kitchen. When my food arrived, a roasted slice of turkey with cranberry sauce and mashed potatoes, it looked beautiful. But I couldn't taste any of it. I sat there pushing food around my plate while laughter from the table beside me drifted across the small space between us. And suddenly, something inside me cracked open. Because I realized this wasn't really about Thanksgiving. It wasn't about Piper's pregnancy. It wasn't even about that phone call. This was about a pattern that had shaped my entire life. For 27 years, I had been trying to earn a seat at their table. I had bent myself into smaller and smaller shapes. I swallowed hurt. I apologized for having feelings. I stayed quiet when I should have spoken. And when I did speak, I was told I was too much, too sensitive, too dramatic. And where had that gotten me? A corner table, a cold dinner, an Instagram photo with no empty chair. If I kept shrinking myself like this eventually, there would be nothing left of me. The tears came before I could stop them. I turned toward the window, hoping no one would notice, and pressed my napkin against my eyes, trying to disappear the way I always did. But then I heard a voice beside me. "Honey, are you okay?" I froze when I heard the voice. It was warm and soft, close enough that I realized someone was standing beside my table. Slowly, I lowered the napkin from my face and looked up. The older woman from the large family next to me was standing there. She had silver hair pulled neatly back and kind eyes that seemed to study my face with gentle attention. For a moment, I didn't know what to say. "I'm fine," I said automatically too quickly. "Just allergies." She raised one eyebrow slightly. Not accusing, not skeptical, just knowing. "Allergies don't usually make people cry into their napkin on Thanksgiving," she said gently. A sound escaped me that was half laugh, half broken sob. "That obvious only to someone paying attention," she replied. She extended her hand. "I'm Margaret. Daisy," I said softly, shaking it. "Well, Daisy," she continued, glancing toward her family's crowded table. "No one should eat alone on Thanksgiving." Then she looked back at me. "Why don't you come join us?" I shook my head immediately. "Oh no, I couldn't do that," I said quickly. "I don't want to intrude." "You're not intruding," she said with a small smile. "I'm inviting." "There's a difference." "I really appreciate it," I said, gesturing toward the busy table. "But you're clearly celebrating." "My husband tells terrible jokes," she said, as if I hadn't spoken. "And my son Theo keeps trying to start political debates." She leaned a little closer. "You might as well come suffer with the rest of us." Across the table, the older man, who I assumed was her husband, lifted his hand and waved cheerfully. "She won't take no for an answer," he called out. 42 years of marriage, and I've never won an argument." A younger man sitting nearby laughed. "He's not exaggerating," he said. I looked down at my untouched plate. Cold turkey, mashed potatoes I hadn't eaten, a napkin still damp with tears. Then I looked back at Margaret. Her expression was warm and patient, not pushing, just open. I took a slow breath. "Okay," I said quietly. "If you're sure?" "I'm very sure," she replied, resting a gentle hand on my shoulder. "Come on. We've got too much pie anyway." My legs felt shaky as I stood and followed her to their table. Someone immediately pulled out a chair. Another person cleared space between plates. Before I even sat down, a glass of red wine appeared in my hand, and someone passed me a warm dinner roll. Everything happened so quickly I barely processed it. "I'm Arthur," the older man said, offering a handshake. "Margaret's husband." He gestured around the table. "This is our son Daniel and his wife Claire, their kids Oliver and Lucy, and our youngest son Theo." Everyone smiled or waved. "Hi," I said awkwardly. "I'm Daisy." "Nice to meet you," Lucy chirped. She looked about 8 years old and was wearing a paper turkey hat. Daniel passed me a bowl of mashed potatoes. "So Daisy," he said, "what do you do?" "I'm a graphic designer," I replied. "Mostly freelance." "That's impressive," Claire said. "I can barely draw a stick figure." Mom Oliver said seriously, "Stick figures are easy." The entire table laughed. Not at anyone. With each other. The sound caught me off guard. Theo leaned slightly toward me. "Fair warning," he whispered. "My dad's about to tell a joke." "I am not," Arthur protested. "You are," Margaret said calmly. Arthur lifted his wineglass and grinned. "Okay, fine. What did the turkey say to the computer?" Oh no! Daniel groaned. Dad, please don't, Theo added. Arthur ignored them. Google, Google, Google. The kids burst into laughter. Claire covered her face. Theo shook his head dramatically. And before I could stop myself, I laughed. A real laugh. The first one I'd had all day. Arthur raised his glass proudly. A toast, he declared. To unexpected guests who make our table complete. Everyone lifted their glasses. Including me. I hesitated before gently clinking mine against Margaret's. As I looked around the table, something warm spread through my chest. Not the polite warmth I was used to. This felt easy. Natural. Like belonging. Dinner continued with stories, jokes, and playful arguments about football and pie flavors. After the plates were cleared and the kids ran off to explore the restaurant, the conversation broke into smaller groups. Margaret quietly moved to the chair beside mine. How are you doing? She asked softly. Better, I admitted. This is really nice. Thank you. You're welcome, she said. Then she tilted her head slightly. But that's not what I asked. I looked down at the empty plate in front of me. I'm okay, I said after a moment. Just having a rough Thanksgiving? She waited patiently. No pressure, no judgment. Just quiet understanding. Do you want to tell me why you were sitting alone tonight? She asked gently. The truth felt embarrassing to say out loud, but something about Margaret made it hard to lie. My mom called 3 days ago, I said finally, and she told me not to come home for Thanksgiving. My sister's pregnant again, and apparently she didn't want drama. Margaret nodded slowly. Drama, she repeated. That's what they call it when I ask questions they don't want to answer, I said quietly. She placed her hand gently over mine. Daisy, she said softly. You are not the problem. The words hit me so hard I almost stopped breathing. She smiled kindly. I spent 30 years as a family lawyer, she continued, and the people who accuse others of causing drama are usually the ones creating it. They just need someone else to blame. I stared at her. Those were the words I had needed to hear my entire life. You deserve better than that, she said gently. And for the first time in years, I believed it. For a moment after Margaret said those words, I couldn't speak. You are not the problem. It sounded simple. But when you've spent most of your life believing the opposite, those words land like a shockwave. I sat there staring at her, my fingers still resting under her hand, trying to breathe normally again. I started, then stopped. My throat felt tight. Margaret didn't rush me. She simply squeezed my hand gently and took a sip of her wine as if we had all the time in the world. Around us, the restaurant buzzed with the comfortable chaos of Thanksgiving dinner. The kids had wandered toward the windows to watch the snow. Arthur and Daniel were debating last week's football game. Theo was laughing at something Claire had said. Life continued. But at our corner of the table, everything felt strangely still. I've spent a long time wondering if maybe they're right, I admitted quietly. About what Margaret asked. That I'm difficult. That I cause problems without meaning to. Margaret's expression stayed calm, like someone who had heard stories like this before. Let me tell you something I've seen many times, she said gently. In families where one person is always blamed for being dramatic or difficult, that person is usually just the one who notices when something isn't fair. I swallowed. Families don't always like that, she continued. Especially when it forces them to look at things they'd rather ignore. Her words settled over me slowly. For years I had replayed every argument in my head, wondering if I had been too emotional, too demanding, too sensitive. But Margaret spoke with such quiet certainty that it shook something loose inside me. You're not broken, Daisy, she said softly. You're just someone who wanted to be treated fairly. My eyes stung again. I reached for my napkin, embarrassed. Sorry, I said. Don't apologize, she replied immediately. There's nothing wrong with having feelings. For a few minutes, we sat quietly while the rest of the table continued talking and laughing. Eventually, dessert arrived. Arthur insisted that everyone try at least 2 pies, which started an animated debate about whether pumpkin or apple deserved the title of Thanksgiving champion. Theo leaned toward me. "So, Daisy," he said, important question. "What's that? Where do you stand in the pie debate?" I blinked, surprised. "Apple," I said. Arthur pointed at me triumphantly. "See? A woman of taste." Daniel groaned while everyone laughed. Margaret sat beside me, smiling, clearly enjoying the chaos. By the time coffee was poured and plates were cleared, I realized something surprising. I felt comfortable. Not like a guest. Not like someone intruding. Just included. The evening wound down slowly. Conversation softened. The kids returned to the table sleepy and quiet. Lucy curled up beside her mother while Oliver rested his head on Daniel's shoulder. Eventually, the server placed the check on the table. Instinctively, I reached for my wallet. Arthur waved his hand immediately. "No, no," he said firmly. "Our treat." "Oh, I can't let you do that," I protested. "You absolutely can," he said warmly. "Consider it a Thanksgiving tradition." "What tradition?" Theo asked. Arthur shrugged. "Buying dinner for new friends." The word friends landed in my chest in a way I hadn't expected. After the bill was settled, everyone gathered coats and scarves. Outside, the snow was falling harder. In the restaurant lobby, Margaret reached into her purse and handed me a small cream-colored card. I looked down. Margaret Lawson, J.D. Family Law, retired below. It was a phone number and a Brookline address. "If you ever need someone to talk to," she said gently, "call me." I looked up. "You mean that I do?" Arthur stepped beside us, pulling on his coat. "And if you ever feel like joining us again," he added, "we have Sunday dinners every week." I shook my head automatically. "That's really kind, but I couldn't." "You could?" Theo said, stepping closer. "And you should." I looked at him. He smiled easily. "Mom doesn't say things she doesn't mean." Margaret squeezed my hand. "Family isn't blood, Daisy," she said. "Family is who shows up." For a moment, none of us spoke. I stood there holding the card of a woman I had met only a few hours earlier. A woman who had already shown me more kindness than my own family had in years. Outside, the snow-covered street glowed under yellow streetlights as families left the restaurant laughing and carrying leftovers. I looked back at the Lawsons. Arthur helped Margaret wrap her scarf. Daniel lifted Lucy into his arms while Oliver tugged sleepily at his sleeve. Theo stood by the door holding it open. They looked like the kind of family you see in movies. Theo glanced back at me. "Well?" he asked. I hesitated. Part of me wanted to say no. Accepting kindness like that felt strangely dangerous. But another part of me, the part that had laughed at Arthur's terrible joke and felt warmth at their table, didn't want the evening to end. "Okay," I said quietly. "Maybe I'll stop by sometime." Margaret smiled like she had expected that answer. "Good," she said. What I didn't know then was that saying yes to that small invitation would change everything. I had no idea I had just met the people who would become my real family. I didn't go to Sunday dinner the next week, or the week after that. Every Sunday afternoon, I would think about the invitation Margaret and Arthur had given me, and every Sunday I would talk myself out of it. It felt strange, too forward, like I would be inserting myself into someone else's family gathering without really belonging there. They had been kind to me on Thanksgiving, yes, but that didn't mean they actually expected me to show up again. At least, that was what I kept telling myself. Still, every Sunday around 5 o'clock, I found myself wondering what their dining room looked like. I wondered if Arthur told the same terrible jokes. I wondered if the kids argued about pie flavors the way they had at the restaurant. And then I would push the thought away. I didn't want to risk feeling like an outsider again, But Margaret didn't forget about me. The following Tuesday evening, my phone rang while I was finishing up some design work at my kitchen table. The caller ID showed a number I didn't recognize. "Hello, Daisy," Margaret's voice came through the line, warm and familiar. "Hi," I said, surprised. "I didn't expect you to call." "I hope that's okay," she said lightly. "I just wanted to check in and see how you're doing." It was such a simple gesture, but no one in my family had ever called just to check on me before. "I'm good," I said slowly. "Working a lot." "That sounds like you," she replied with a small laugh. "Have you been eating properly or surviving on coffee and takeout?" "Probably the second one." "Well, that won't do," she said. "You're always welcome to come by Sunday dinners, you know." Her tone wasn't pushy, just open. I hesitated for a moment. "I know," I said. "Whenever you're ready," she added gently. By early December, the invitation was still sitting in the back of my mind. That Sunday evening, I found myself standing on a quiet street in Brookline, staring at a beautiful Victorian house with a wraparound porch. Warm yellow lights glowed through the windows. I checked the address on the business card again. This was definitely the place. For 5 full minutes, I stood on the sidewalk trying to gather the courage to walk up the steps. It felt ridiculous. I was a grown woman, not a nervous teenager. But something about knocking on that door felt important. Like crossing a line into something new. Finally, before I could change my mind, I walked up the porch steps and raised my hand to knock. The door opened before my knuckles even touched the wood. "There you are?" Margaret pulled me into a hug before I had time to react. It was so natural, so immediate, that I almost forgot how to hug her back. "We saved you a seat," she said, smiling. The smell of dinner drifted through the house, roasted chicken, herbs, something buttery and warm. Inside, the dining room table was already set. Arthur looked up from the kitchen doorway when we walked in. "Well, look at that," he said with a grin. Our Thanksgiving guest decided to come back. Theo appeared behind him, carrying a stack of plates. "Took you long enough," he teased. I laughed nervously. "I wasn't sure if you meant the invitation." Margaret waved a dismissive hand. "When I invite someone to dinner, Daisy, I mean it." That evening turned out to be the first of many Sundays. Over the next 6 months, Sunday dinners became a regular part of my life. Arthur taught me how to play chess in the living room after dinner, even though I lost every single game. Margaret showed me how to make her pie crust recipe, the one she insisted she had never written down for anyone before. Daniel and Claire's kids started calling me Aunt Daisy without anyone ever suggesting it. And Theo. Theo and I became friends. Real friends. The kind who texted each other random thoughts at 2 in the morning. The kind who argued about movies and music, and which pizza place in Boston was actually the best. The kind who sat next to each other at the dinner table without anyone needing to arrange the seating. Months passed. Winter faded into spring. And during all that time, I didn't hear from my biological family once. No calls, no texts, not even a Christmas card. At first I noticed. Then slowly I stopped noticing, because something else had quietly taken its place. For the first time in my life, I wasn't performing for love. I wasn't shrinking myself to make other people comfortable. I wasn't trying to earn my place. I was simply welcomed, loved. And for the first time in 27 years, I understood what it felt like to come home. Have you ever heard words that completely changed how you saw yourself? If you believe the right words at the right moment can change a life, leave a 1 in the comments. Your responses help me know these stories are reaching the people who truly need them. One spring afternoon, about 8 months after that first Thanksgiving at Harborview Grill, Margaret and I were sitting together on the back porch of the Lawson house. The air was warm for the first time in weeks. Small tulips were pushing their way through the garden beds, and birds kept swooping down to fight over the feeder Arthur had hung near the fence. Inside the house, I could hear Arthur and Theo shouting at the television. Apparently, a baseball game had just taken a turn neither of them liked. Margaret handed me a cup of tea and sat down beside me. For a while, we watched the garden quietly. Then she asked a question that made my chest tighten just a little. "Have you heard from your parents?" I shook my head. "No." She nodded gently. "Have you reached out to them?" I traced my finger along the rim of the mug, thinking about it honestly. "No," I said finally. "I haven't." Margaret didn't look surprised. "Do you want to?" I considered that question more carefully. Sometimes I admitted, usually late at night. I'll think about calling my mom and trying to explain everything, trying to make her understand. And then I remember there's nothing to explain. I said quietly, "She knows what she did." Margaret watched me carefully. "She just doesn't think it was wrong." "That's a difficult realization," she said softly. "It is." A breeze rustled through the trees, scattering petals across the porch steps. "I keep waiting to feel guilty," I continued. "Everyone always says you should forgive your family no matter what. Blood is thicker than water and all that." Margaret let out a small, thoughtful hum. "You know," she said, "I've never really believed that phrase." I looked at her. "You haven't?" "No." She smiled slightly. "During my years practicing family law, I helped a lot of people protect the families they had built, not just the ones they were born into." I tilted my head. "What do you mean?" She took a slow sip of her tea. "Well," she said, "the law recognizes something most people take a long time to learn. And what's that? That family isn't always about blood." I frowned slightly, trying to understand what she meant. "Family," Margaret continued, "is about commitment, about showing up, about choosing someone again and again." She looked out across the garden for a moment, and sometimes she added gently, "People decide to make that choice official." I wasn't sure what she was hinting at, but the idea lingered in the back of my mind. "Official how?" I asked. Margaret smiled, that quiet, knowing smile she often wore when she didn't want to rush a conversation. "There are ways," she said simply. "Legal ones." I blinked. "Legal." She reached over and patted my hand. "Something to think about," she said softly. "Whenever you're ready." Then just like that, she changed the subject. She started talking about her tomato plants and whether the weather that year would be warm enough for a good harvest. But her earlier words stayed with me long after the conversation ended. They settled somewhere deep in my mind, like seeds waiting for the right moment to grow. Over the next 2 years, life changed slowly, almost so gradually that I barely noticed it happening. Theo and I spent more and more time together. At first, it was just movie nights after Sunday dinner, then long walks through Boston Common, then late-night phone calls about work life, everything and nothing. Somewhere along the way, our friendship became something else, something deeper, something that felt less like a beginning and more like discovering something that had quietly been there all along. 2 years after that first Thanksgiving, Theo asked me to meet him for dinner at Harborview Grill, the same restaurant where we had first met. As I slid into the booth across from him, I smiled. "This feels very circular," I said. Theo laughed nervously, adjusting the napkin on the table. "That's kind of the point." I tilted my head. "What do you mean?" He reached across the table and took my hand, and suddenly I realized. This dinner wasn't just dinner. Theo's hand was warm around mine as we sat across from each other in the same booth at Harborview Grill, where everything had started 2 years earlier. The restaurant looked almost exactly the same as it had that night. Soft golden lights, polished wooden tables, the quiet hum of conversation filling the room. But this time, I wasn't the woman crying alone in the corner. Theo cleared his throat, his fingers tightening slightly around mine. "Daisy," he said carefully, "I've been trying to figure out how to say this for months." My heart began to beat faster. He took a slow breath. "I want to spend the rest of my life choosing you." For a moment, the world seemed to pause. I stared at him, my mind struggling to catch up with what he was saying. Theo smiled softly. I know your family hurt you, he continued. I know you're used to people who are supposed to love you walking away. His eyes stayed steady on mine. But I'm not going anywhere. Then he reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small velvet box. Daisy Knox, he said, his voice shaking just a little. Will you marry me? I felt my throat tighten. This man had been my friend first, then my closest confidant. He had stood beside me through 2 years of healing without ever pushing, without ever demanding anything in return. And now he was asking me to build a life with him. Yes, I whispered. Then louder through tears I couldn't stop. Yes. Theo laughed in relief and slipped the ring onto my finger. Around us, the restaurant erupted into applause. Only then did I realize people had been watching. At the far corner of the room, Arthur and Margaret were sitting at a small table with champagne glasses already waiting. Margaret winked at me. She insisted we come. Theo admitted, laughing. Apparently, she didn't trust me to plan this without supervision. That night marked the beginning of something new, not just a relationship, a future. The months that followed were filled with excitement and chaos as we began planning the wedding. There were venue tours, cake tastings, endless conversations about flowers, music, and seating charts. It was overwhelming. But it was also joyful in a way I had never allowed myself to imagine before. Still, one question kept circling back in my mind. Wedding invitations, specifically one line on them. Parents of the bride. I sat in the Lawson living room one evening with the draft invitation spread across my lap, staring at the blank space where those words should go. Robert and Helen Knox. Those were the names of my biological parents, but they hadn't spoken to me in more than 2 years. No calls, no birthday messages, no acknowledgement that I existed. Putting their names on my wedding invitation felt dishonest, like giving them credit for something they had never been part of. I was pacing the living room when Margaret walked in. She watched me for a moment before speaking. What's troubling you, sweetheart? I handed her the invitation. That line, I said quietly. I don't know what to write there. She sat beside me on the couch and studied the card. I remember mentioning something to you once, she said slowly, about legal recognition for chosen family. I nodded. You said the law recognizes the families people build. It does. I looked up at her. What did you mean by that exactly? Margaret's voice softened. Adult adoption. I blinked. That's a real thing. Very real, she said. It's a legal process where an adult can be formally adopted by another family. My heart began to pound. It creates a legal parent-child relationship, she continued. A new birth certificate, new legal next of kin, everything. I stared at her. The idea felt almost too big to process. You mean, someone could actually choose their family like that? Margaret smiled gently. Yes. My voice came out barely above a whisper. Would you and Arthur ever consider... I couldn't finish the sentence. I didn't have to. Margaret pulled me into a tight hug before I could say another word. We've considered you our daughter since the night we met you, she said softly. We were just waiting for you to be ready. The adoption process took several months. Paperwork, court appearances, legal filings, but with Margaret guiding every step, it never felt cold or bureaucratic. It felt like a ceremony, a confirmation of something that had already been true for a long time. The day the judge signed the final order, I officially became Daisy Lawson. I had a new birth certificate, new legal parents, and a family that had chosen me just as fiercely as I had chosen them. Theo and I set the wedding date for the following June. When the invitations were finally printed, the line I had once feared writing now filled me with pride. Parents of the bride, Arthur and Margaret Lawson. But I should have known something. Families like the one I came from don't stay silent forever. And eventually, the Knox family found out. The wedding day arrived warm and golden. It was June in Napa Valley, the kind of day that felt almost unreal in its perfection. The sky stretched wide and cloudless above rows of green vineyards that rolled gently over the hills. A soft breeze carried the scent of summer flowers through the air. Theo and I had chosen an outdoor ceremony at a small vineyard just outside town. The reception would be held in a restored stone barn nearby, decorated with white roses greenery and long wooden tables that glowed under strands of hanging lights. It was exactly the kind of wedding I had never dared to imagine for myself. In the bridal suite, I stood in front of a tall mirror while Margaret carefully adjusted the veil pinned into my hair. "You look beautiful," she said softly. I met her eyes in the reflection. "You really do," she added, her voice thick with emotion. "Absolutely beautiful." For a moment, I simply stared at the woman in the mirror. 5 years earlier, I had been sitting alone at a restaurant table wondering what was wrong with me, wondering why the people who were supposed to love me always seemed to choose someone else. That woman had been smaller somehow, quieter, unsure of whether she deserved happiness at all. The woman standing here now looked different. Stronger, calmer, certain. On the vanity beside me lay a copy of the wedding program. Without thinking, I picked it up and ran my fingers across the printed words. Parents of the bride, Arthur and Margaret Lawson. Underneath in smaller text was a line Theo had suggested adding, "The family who chose her." Margaret noticed me looking at it. "Are you nervous?" she asked gently. "About marrying Theo?" I smiled. "Not even a little." She laughed softly. "Then what's on your mind?" I hesitated. "The rest of today," I admitted. Margaret's expression softened with understanding. After my mother had shown up at my apartment months earlier demanding an invitation to the wedding, Theo and I had quietly hired security for the event, just in case. I had tried not to think about it too much, but the possibility lingered in the back of my mind. "What if they show up?" I said quietly. Margaret stepped closer and rested both hands on my shoulders. "Then we handle it," she said calmly. Her eyes were steady and reassuring. "Whatever happens today, you have a family who chose you." She squeezed my shoulders gently. "And we will always choose you." Emotion caught in my chest. Before I could stop myself, I stepped forward and wrapped my arms around her. "I love you, Mom," I whispered. It was the first time I had called her that. The word felt so natural leaving my mouth that it startled me. Margaret pulled back slightly, her eyes glistening. "I love you too, sweetheart," she said quietly. "My daughter." A soft knock sounded on the door. Claire peeked inside with a wide smile. "It's almost time," she said. Through the window behind her, I could see guests beginning to gather in the vineyard. Chairs were arranged in neat rows along a flower-lined aisle that led toward a wooden arch covered in white roses. At the far end of the aisle, Theo was already waiting. Even from a distance, I could see the nervous excitement in his posture as he spoke with the officiant. My heart swelled at the sight of him. "This is it," Claire said softly. Margaret picked up the small bouquet of white flowers resting on the table and placed it gently in my hands. "You ready?" she asked. I took a deep breath. "Yes." We stepped outside into the warm afternoon sunlight. Guests turned in their seats as the music began. Arthur appeared at my side, offering his arm with quiet pride. "Shall we?" he said. As we began walking down the aisle together, I felt something settle inside me. Peace. This moment wasn't about the people who had walked away from me years ago. It was about the people who had stepped forward instead. Theo's eyes filled with tears when he saw me approaching. By the time we reached the front half, the guests were already wiping their eyes. The ceremony passed in a beautiful blur. The vows we had written ourselves made people laugh and cry in equal measure. Theo promised to always choose me first. I promised never to forget the night a stranger had invited me to join her family's table. When he slipped the ring onto my finger, something inside me clicked into place. like the final piece of a puzzle I had been trying to solve my entire life. By the power vested in me, the officiant said warmly, I now pronounce you husband and wife. Theo pulled me into a kiss as cheers erupted from the guests. For a few perfect minutes, nothing existed except joy. But later during the reception inside the stone barn, as laughter and music filled the air, a security guard quietly approached me. Mrs. Lawson, he said discreetly, there are two people at the entrance. My stomach tightened. They claim to be your parents. Theo appeared at my side instantly. What's going on? He asked. I took a slow breath. My biological parents are here. His expression hardened. I'll handle it. I shook my head. No. I squeezed his hand gently. This is my moment, I said. I'll handle it. Outside the barn doors, my past had finally arrived, and this time, I wasn't afraid to face it. For a moment, I stood there holding Theo's hand, while music and laughter from the reception continued around us. Part of me had expected this. Ever since my mother showed up at my apartment months earlier demanding an invitation, I had known there was a chance they might try something. Still, hearing the words out loud made my chest tighten. My biological parents are here, I repeated quietly. Theo glanced toward the barn entrance, his jaw tightening. I'll take care of it, he said firmly. I shook my head. No. He turned to me confused. This is my moment, I said gently. If they're here, I want to face it myself. He studied my face for a second before nodding. Okay, he said softly. But I'm not leaving your side. I squeezed his hand. The security guard waited beside us. What would you like me to do? He asked. For a moment, I considered my options. I could have them removed immediately. I could pretend they weren't there. I could avoid the confrontation entirely. But something inside me didn't want that. If they had come all this way, they should see what they had lost. They should see the life I had built without them. Let them in, I said. The guard hesitated. Are you sure? Yes. But seat them in the back, I added. Not with the family. He nodded and walked away. Theo slipped an arm around my waist. You okay? He asked quietly. I am, I said. And surprisingly, it was true. A few minutes later, I saw them. My mother and father stood awkwardly near the back of the barn just inside the doorway. Helen and Robert Knox. My mother looked exactly the same as the last time I saw her, perfectly styled hair, sharp eyes, and the same tight expression that always made it feel like she was silently judging everything around her. My father stood slightly behind her, hands shoved in his pockets, looking uncomfortable. Lost. They scanned the room clearly, trying to understand what was happening. The reception continued around them. Guests laughed. Servers carried trays of champagne. Music played softly in the background. No one seemed to recognize them. To everyone else, they were simply two strangers standing near the door. Then the timing turned out to be perfect. The master of ceremonies stepped toward the microphone. Ladies and gentlemen, he announced cheerfully, may I have your attention for a moment? Gradually, the room quieted. Conversations paused. Glasses lowered. Theo and I stood near the dance floor watching as everyone turned toward the stage. The MC smiled warmly. Before we continue tonight's celebration, he said we'd like to introduce some very special people. Across the room, I saw my mother straighten slightly. Her expression shifted immediately. Anticipation. At most weddings, this was the moment when the bride's parents were acknowledged. Theo squeezed my hand. The MC continued. Please join me in welcoming the parents of the bride. My mother lifted her chin. Even from across the room, I could see the satisfied smile beginning to form on her face. Then the MC finished the sentence. Arthur and Margaret Lawson. The room erupted in applause. Guests turned toward the head table where Arthur and Margaret stood smiling as people cheered. Someone whistled. The photographer rushed forward to capture the moment. And across the barn. My mother's face drained of color. I watched the realization unfold slowly. First confusion, then disbelief. Her eyes darted between Arthur and Margaret as guests congratulated them. "What did he just say?" she whispered sharply. My father looked equally stunned. I don't know. But I could see the truth beginning to settle over her. Arthur and Margaret Lawson, the parents of the bride, not Helen and Robert Knox. To everyone in that room, the couple standing proudly at the head table were simply what they appeared to be: my parents, my real ones. My mother grabbed my father's arm. "This is ridiculous," she hissed. Guests nearby continued clapping, unaware of the drama unfolding near the back of the barn. But for my mother, the ground had just shifted beneath her feet. She pushed through the crowd before anyone could stop her. Within seconds, she stood in front of me, her face flushed and eyes blazing. My father trailed behind her, looking like he wished he could disappear. "What is going on?" she demanded in a harsh whisper. Her voice trembled with anger. "Who are those people?" I met her gaze calmly. "My legal parents," I said. Her eyes widened. "What, I was adopted 2 years ago," I said evenly. For a moment she looked like she had misheard me. Then she staggered back half a step. You did what?" I lifted my left hand, my wedding ring catching the light. "I didn't replace you," I said quietly. "You abandoned me first." Guests nearby had begun to notice the confrontation. Conversations faded, heads turned, the music softened in the background. My mother's voice dropped lower, trembling with fury. "That's not fair." I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. "For 27 years I tried to earn a place in this family," I said calmly. "And you know what I got?" Silence spread across the nearby tables. "A Thanksgiving dinner alone," I continued. "An Instagram photo with no empty chair." My father looked down at the floor, but my mother stared at me like she no longer recognized the person in front of her. "I'm still your mother," she snapped. I shook my head slowly. "Not legally." Theo stepped closer beside me. "And not emotionally either," I added. And for the first time in my life, I didn't feel small saying it. The barn had gone completely silent. Around us, 100 guests stood frozen, pretending not to stare, but clearly unable to look away. The music had faded, conversations had stopped, and for a moment the only sound I could hear was my own breathing. My mother stood in front of me, furious. My father looked like he had aged 10 years in the last 10 minutes. Then, for the first time in my entire life, my father spoke. "Daisy." His voice was rough, almost unsteady. I turned toward him slowly. He stepped forward, shoulders slightly hunched like he was carrying something heavy. I'm sorry." The words hung in the air. In 27 years, I had never heard my father apologize for anything that had happened between us. "I should have done better," he said quietly. "I should have stood up for you." My chest tightened. His hair had gone grayer than I remembered. His face looked tired in a way that had nothing to do with age, but the thing that shocked me most was the tears in his eyes. "I knew what was happening," he continued. "I knew how your mother treated you, how Piper treated you. And I just stood there." My mother grabbed his arm. "Robert, what are you doing?" she snapped. But he gently pulled away from her. "I was a coward," he said, still looking at me. "You were my daughter, my little girl, and I let them make you feel like you didn't matter." A tear slid down his cheek. "I'm so sorry." For years that was all I had ever wanted. Not excuses, not arguments, just someone in my family admitting the truth. I swallowed. "I know," I said softly. He looked surprised. "I know you're sorry." For a moment, hope flickered across his face, but I continued. "Sorry doesn't undo the years you stood there and watched." His shoulders sagged. "Sorry doesn't give me back the childhood where I felt invisible." Around us, guests shifted uncomfortably, but stayed quiet. "And sorry doesn't make this okay." He nodded slowly. I know, he whispered. Behind me, Margaret had quietly stepped closer. She didn't interrupt. She simply placed a hand gently on my arm, a silent reminder that I wasn't alone anymore. My mother noticed immediately. Her eyes flashed with anger. You, she snapped, pointing at Margaret. You're the one who stole my daughter. Margaret didn't move. I didn't steal anything, Mrs. Knox, she said calmly. My mother's voice rose. Then what do you call this? Before Margaret could respond, Arthur stepped forward. Arthur Lawson was not a confrontational man. In all the years I had known him, I had never heard him raise his voice. But when he spoke now, there was steel in it. I think it's time for you to leave. My mother stared at him in disbelief. Who are you to tell us that? Arthur stood a little straighter. I'm her father. The words carried clearly across the quiet barn. Legally, he added, and in every way that matters. My mother scoffed. You stole our daughter. Arthur shook his head calmly. No, ma'am, he said. We didn't steal anything. Then his voice hardened. You gave her away. The words struck the room like a sudden crack of thunder. My mother flinched. Arthur continued. 5 years ago, my wife and I met Daisy sitting alone in a restaurant on Thanksgiving. Several guests leaned closer, listening. She was sitting by herself while her family celebrated without her. Arthur gestured toward me. My wife invited her to our table. We shared our dinner. We talked. Then he looked directly at my mother. Do you know what she told us that night? My mother stayed silent. Arthur's voice softened slightly. She said she couldn't remember the last time she felt like she mattered to someone. A murmur rippled through the room. 27 years old, he continued, and she couldn't remember ever feeling wanted by her own family. My mother opened her mouth but couldn't seem to find the words. Arthur placed a steady hand on my shoulder. We didn't steal your daughter. He looked her directly in the eyes. We just showed her what family is supposed to look like. Then he turned to the security guards waiting nearby. This is my daughter's wedding day, he said firmly. And I won't let anyone ruin it. He nodded toward the guards. Please escort these people out. The guards stepped forward. Arthur slipped his arm around my shoulders. Daisy is a Lawson now, he said quietly. And Lawsons protect their own. For the first time in my life. That was what a father sounded like. But before the guards could guide my parents away, I raised my hand. Wait. Everyone paused. My mother looked at me with a sudden flicker of hope, as if she believed I might change my mind. Maybe she thought guilt would win. Maybe she thought I would back down like I always had before. I stepped forward until I stood directly in front of them. Mom. Dad. The words still felt strange. I need you to understand something. My mother lifted her chin. What? I took a slow breath. I don't hate you. She blinked in surprise. I've made peace with who you are, I continued. You're not villains. I looked at both of them. You're just people who couldn't love me the way I needed to be loved. My father lowered his head. My mother's jaw tightened. You chose comfort over fairness, I said calmly. You let one daughter shine while the other disappeared. Then I straightened my shoulders. But I've also made peace with who I am. Silence filled the barn again. And who I am? I said clearly, as someone who deserves to be chosen. Not second. Not as an afterthought. First. I gestured toward Arthur and Margaret. You didn't choose me. Then I met their eyes again. They did. My voice remained steady. And I choose them. The room stayed perfectly still. I'm not erasing you from my history, I said quietly. But you don't get a seat at my table anymore. I nodded to the guards. Goodbye, Mom. Goodbye, Dad. As they were escorted out of the barn, the applause began slowly around the room, and this time, I didn't feel small at all. For a moment after my parents were escorted out of the barn, the room was completely silent. Then someone near the back began clapping. Another person joined. Within seconds, the entire room filled with warm applause. Not loud or dramatic, just steady, supportive. The kind that says, people understand what just happened. Marcus wrapped his arm around my shoulders. "You okay?" he asked quietly. I took a breath and nodded. "Yeah," I said. And for the first time in years, it was true. The music slowly started again. Guests returned to their tables. Conversations picked up. Laughter filled the barn once more. The reception continued exactly as we had hoped. Marcus and I danced. We cut the cake while our friends cheered. Richard gave a speech that made half the room laugh, and the other half wipe their eyes. During the mother-daughter dance, Eleanor held me close. "You're my daughter," she whispered. And hearing those words didn't feel strange anymore. It felt right. For the rest of the night, I didn't think about the confrontation again. I just allowed myself to be happy. The next morning, my phone started buzzing. Apparently, news travels fast in families. Messages poured in from relatives I hadn't heard from in years, cousins, aunts, uncles. Most of them had the same opinion. "How could you do that to your mother? Family is family no matter what. You broke your father's heart." I read a few messages before putting my phone down. For years, I had tried to explain myself to people who didn't really want to understand. I wasn't doing that anymore. But later that afternoon, a message appeared that made me stop. It was from my Aunt Patricia, my father's younger sister. We had never been especially close, but she had always been kinder to me than the rest of the family. Her message was short. "Daisy, I heard what happened. I just want you to know, I'm proud of you." Another message followed. "Your mother and Piper treated you unfairly for years. Everyone knew it even if they didn't say it out loud. You deserved better. You always did." I stared at the screen for a moment before replying. "Thank you. That means more than you know." My mother chose a different response. Later that evening, someone sent me a screenshot of a Facebook post she had written. It was long and emotional. She talked about ungrateful children and modern families who don't understand loyalty anymore. She never mentioned my name. She didn't need to. I read it once. Then I deleted the message. That night, I blocked every phone number and social media account connected to the Knox family, not out of anger, out of peace. Life moved forward. A year later, Marcus and I bought a small house just outside Boston. It wasn't huge, but it had a backyard and a porch that caught the evening sun. Best of all, it was only 20 minutes from Richard and Eleanor's house. Close enough for Sunday dinners, far enough for our own space. My career changed too. After years of freelancing, I accepted a full-time position as an art director at a design agency in the city. Marcus was thriving at his architecture firm. Slowly, life settled into something steady and beautiful. Then one evening at Sunday dinner, I shared news that made Eleanor cry immediately. "I'm pregnant." Richard tried not to cry. He failed. Within minutes, everyone at the table was celebrating. A few months later, Eleanor and I were setting up the nursery in our house. "Have you thought about names?" she asked. "Yes," I said. "If it's a girl, Emily. Emily Grace Morrison." Eleanor smiled through tears. "That's beautiful." "The Morrison part is non-negotiable," I said with a small laugh. "I want her to have the name of the family that chose her mother." She hugged me tightly. "You know," she said softly, "when I saw you sitting alone in that restaurant 5 years ago, I had no idea we would end up here." I smiled. "You saved my life that night." She shook her head gently. "No, sweetheart," she said. "You saved yourself. We just showed you it was possible." 5 years after that first Thanksgiving, I stood at the head of the Morrison dining table holding my daughter. The house was full of noise. Emily, 6 months old, was being passed from lap to lap like the most precious treasure in the world. Daniel's kids were playing cards in the corner. Sarah was arguing with Marcus about how to carve the turkey. Richard kept sneaking extra pie when he thought Eleanor wasn't looking. She was. Finally, Eleanor clapped her hands. "All right, everyone," she said. "Before we eat, we need a toast." Then she looked at me. "Daisy, would you do the honors?" I stood slowly, Emily resting in my arms. 5 years earlier, I had been sitting alone in a restaurant wondering if I would ever belong anywhere. Now I stood surrounded by people who had chosen me. 5 years ago tonight, I began. I was sitting alone in a restaurant wondering what was wrong with me. Marcus squeezed my hand under the table. "I thought I was too much." I continued. "Too emotional. Too difficult." I looked at Eleanor. Then a stranger named Eleanor Morrison walked up to my table and said something simple. "No one should eat alone on Thanksgiving." Eleanor wiped her eyes. "So here's my toast," I said, raising my glass. "To family. Not the one we're born into. The one we build. The one we choose. And the one that chooses us back." To family, everyone echoed. Glasses clinked. Emily made a soft, happy sound in my arms. And as I looked around the table at the people who stepped into my life when my own family stepped away, I finally felt something I had spent my entire childhood searching for. Belonging. Completely. Unconditionally. For the first time in my life, I was home. Telling this story taught me something I wish I had understood much earlier. Sometimes the bravest thing you can do is stop begging for a place where you were never truly welcome. For years, I believed love had to be earned by shrinking myself, staying quiet, and accepting less than I deserved. But the truth is, real family isn't built on obligation. It's built on people who show up, who make space for you at the table, and who choose you without hesitation. Walking away from what hurts doesn't mean you are cruel. Sometimes it simply means you are protecting the life you are trying to build. If you were in my place, what would you have done? Would you keep trying to fix a relationship that never changes? Or would you start building something new with the people who treat you with respect? I'd really like to know your answer. And tell me something else. Where in the world are you listening to this story from right now? If this story meant something to you, consider subscribing to the channel. One subscription from you helps stories like this reach someone who might be sitting alone tonight, wondering if they matter. Your comment, even sharing this video, could be the moment that helps someone realize they deserve better too. In a quiet way, you might be helping more people than you think.